And the next item of business is debate on motion 17457 in the name of John Swinney on commemorating the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe VE Day. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on the First Minister to speak to and move the motion around 10 minutes. First Minister.
President, Sir, I'm honoured to open this debate on behalf of the Scottish Government and to share my reflections on the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe. Today we give thanks to every individual who fought and sacrificed to ensure victory over fascism during the Second World War. The 8th of May 1945 was a day of great celebrations across the country and the world as news spread of the Allied victory in Europe. The end of the war in Europe brought with it an enormous sense of relief, as memories of bombings and U-boat attacks could finally begin to fade. However, hope for the future grew instead. Hope especially for the safe return of family and friends overseas. But we must not forget that the fighting continued still in Japan and Myanmar. There were another 3 long months of suffering before the surrender of Japan brought the Second World War to its ultimate conclusion. Yet there are few milestones more significant in our modern history than the one that we celebrate today. Today we enjoy our freedom thanks to our armed forces who served during the Second World War. In 6 years of conflict, 380,000 members of the British Armed Forces lost their lives, as well as over 67,000 civilians. Memorials to the 57,000 Scottish soldiers who died can be found far and wide, from Albania to Greece, from Hungary to Zimbabwe. And for every soldier killed, many broken hearts were left behind to suffer the grief as parents, as children, as friends. So I am forever grateful to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for caring for the many cemeteries here at home and abroad, which offer families peaceful moments to come together and pay their respects to loved ones lost. Of course.
Pam Gossel.
I thank the First Minister for taking that intervention. Will the First Minister join me in recognising and commemorating the British Indian Army before the partition for their brave actions in World War II, with the largest ever volunteer force in history of 2.5 million soldiers?
First Minister.
I will join Pam Gossel in that point of remembrance and indicate that it was significant that that point was made at the VE Day 80 commemoration event in the Usher Hall in Edinburgh, which I thought demonstrated just the scale of the involvement of so many peoples from around the world in the effort to defeat fascism. So I happily associate myself with the point made by Pam Gossel. And before I leave the point I was making on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, it will always be a point of significant remembrance from me of being able to visit the site of my uncle's grave in Argenta in Italy, and to stand on a spot which had been visited some 30 years before by my own grandmother on her only trip out of the United Kingdom to pay her respects at the grave of her beloved son in Argenta. So the decades past neither dampen the memory nor the loss nor our gratitude and pride. Each of us now lives in freedom because of the sacrifices of the men and women who overcame fascism. And every veteran who lives, of course.
Stephen Kerr.
I'm grateful that the First Minister is giving way. I thought the First Minister spoke movingly of his uncle when tributes were paid earlier today. And I've been thinking about my mother, who as a 6-year-old child was pulled from the wreckage of her bombed family home in Birmingham in 1940. Does he agree with me that we all have a sacred responsibility to keep remembrance alive in this country for the sake of those people and also for future generations?
First Minister.
I do agree with Mr Kerr's point, and ironically his example of his mother's experience resonates with that of my own mother-in-law, who was also removed from a tenement block bombed in Birmingham in exactly the same era. So it just is an illustration of how people are affected. But I think there's a really substantial point in what Mr Kerr says, in that, and I have noticed this over my parliamentary life. I think if I think back to when I started my parliamentary life 28 years ago, I would say anecdotally that attendance at remembrance events was perhaps beginning to dwindle. And then in the aftermath of conflict at the start of this century, I have seen attendance at remembrance events grow. And I think that's perhaps an indication that there have been, sadly, reminders of conflict and loss, which are matters of regret, but they reinforce the point that Mr Kerr makes, that we cannot, for a moment, allow ourselves to forget the suffering and the after effects of conflict. So I agree very much with the point that Mr Kerr makes. Scotland owes a debt of gratitude to everybody who played a part in the efforts to defeat fascism. And of course, we live in an environment now where we still witness conflicts that have a profound effect on us all, brought to us by the images that we all see, whether it is of the unbearable suffering in Gaza, which has followed from the terrorist atrocity by Hamas, or whether it's the ongoing suffering of the people of Ukraine in all that they wrestle with. In reflecting on these conflicts, Scotland remembers the sacrifices made by so many individuals in the efforts that have all been undertaken. With Europe Day celebrated tomorrow, we commemorate the signing of the Schuman Declaration and the creation of the beginnings of what is now called the European Union, which of course happened only 5 short years after the end of World War II, which were the steps being taken by France and Germany to ensure that war was not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. And we think back to those founding values of the conflict, which were of that dialogue to overcome conflict. Yet in continental Europe, we still have conflict in Ukraine. I'll give way to Mr.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
The First Minister for giving way. He's absolutely right to reference the European Union as a charter for peace, so that no nation could ever build a war machine again. A lot of that fabric was built upon the foundations of the cohesion of things like the Polish airmen who came to Scotland and fought so bravely in the Battle of Britain, many of whom settled here and are part of an established Polish community. Will you join me in paying tribute to them as well?
First Minister.
Unreservedly, and there is a very strong affinity with the Polish community in the area I represent in Perthshire. Indeed, there is a Polish cemetery in the city of Perth. And of course, what that's led to in subsequent generations has been a very welcoming environment for the Polish community to come to, thankfully, to Perthshire and to contribute to our schools and to our local community, to our churches, to our community activities. So all of that is very welcome, and it's based on some deep roots that Mr Cole-Hamilton has cited. I've been mindful, Presiding Officer, in the last few days and weeks about the sequence of events that have taken place in my own family's life, which rather illustrate some of the mixed feelings there would be on VE Day in 1945. And I haven't really thought about this point until the events of the last few weeks. On the 3rd of April this year, I attended a memorial event down at Ocean Terminal, where there's a memorial to my late uncle, Thomas Hunter, and which has stood there for many years. And I attended that on the 3rd of April 2025, just a few weeks ago. Here we are today, marking VE Day, a difference of 35 days. So what's made me think about is that on the 3rd of April 1945, my mother's family were devastated by the news of the loss of my uncle. 35 days later, the streets were jubilant with people celebrating the end of the war. Quite understandably, of course, there was an enormous sense of relief. But the contrast, which has struck me, that there must have been in that household between the nursing of unbearable grief, which I saw at later stages in my life when I became conscious of my family's experience and understood the gravity of the loss that was felt in my grandmother and grandfather's household, yet outside of their front door there was jubilation, understandable jubilation. I simply leave that observation with Parliament to recognise the fact that whilst there was great relief on the 8th of May 1945, there was still a lot of suffering going on in households the length and breadth of the country. And that contrast of the sense of loss of individuals is something that we should never forget. Today, the Deputy First Minister has attended a commemoration in the City of Glasgow on my behalf, and the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution has represented the Government at the National Commemorative Service at Westminster Abbey.
I can give you time back.
I would happily give way to Mr Brown.
Keith Brown.
In the intervention, could I just mention, of course, and I've mentioned this to you, to the First Minister before, that your uncle, his memory is recalled by every single person that goes through Marines training, which is a lengthy and difficult process. Everybody learns about the exploits of Corporal Thomas Hunter, because he was the only Victoria Cross given to a Marine in the Second World War. So at least that should provide, I hope, some comfort to your family that his name is always remembered.
First Minister.
I'm grateful to my colleague and friend Mr Brown, who of course has distinguished service of his own in the Royal Marines, for that reminder. But it was also very powerfully made clear to me when I attended a commemoration event that the Royal Marines organised just a few weeks ago to mark the 80th anniversary of my uncle's death, and to recognise the significance of his contribution to the history of the Royal Marines. Presiding Officer, I draw my remarks to a close. On this 80th anniversary, Scotland pays tribute to our Second World War generation. We thank all those who have served or are serving today in our armed forces, and together in their honour we dedicate ourselves to enhancing democracy, standing steadfast against fascism and building a better, safer, more peaceful world. Many towns and cities across the country are staging beacon lighting ceremonies from 9 p.m. tonight. The lighting of these beacons represents something which is fundamental to our society, the light of hope emerging from the dreadful bleakness of darkness and war. A hope we now need more than ever, a hope that inspires us all to act, to reach out, to be champions of peace and democracy at home, in Europe and in the world. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, First Minister. I now call on Russell Finlay. Around 7 minutes. Mr Finlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today marks 80 years since the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. After 6 years of bloodshed and horror, our country awoke to the light of freedom as the dark forces of fascism were vanquished. The victory announcement was made by Winston Churchill on the 8th of May 1945 at 3 p.m. Following his radio address, the Prime Minister spoke from a Whitehall balcony to huge crowds of people celebrating on the streets below. And this is some of what he said. God bless you all. This is your victory. It is the victory of the cause of freedom in every land. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. My dear friends, this is your hour. This is not a victory of a party or of any class. It's the victory of the great British nation as a whole. The worldwide death toll from this industrial-scale conflict is difficult to even get your head around. Up to 85 million lives were lost, military and civilian. Tens of thousands of brave Scots went off to war, only to fall in foreign fields. The average age of a Scottish serviceman killed in World War II was just 21. To our generation and the next, who have only ever known peace, the deeds of the greatest generation are almost unfathomable. And it's been heartening to see so many events being held across Scotland to mark VE Day. And it is right and proper that war memorials stand proudly and prominently in communities across the land. Today especially we remember, but these serve as a permanent reminder of their bravery and sacrifice. Many thousands of Scots were also killed at home as German bombers targeted industrial areas, including Clydebank, Greenock and many other towns. The war touched every family, every town, every single workplace. In 1940, when hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk, tens of thousands were captured. They included my grandfather's brother, who endured a forced march to a prisoner of war camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. Miraculously, he survived the disease, violence and squalor of the camp to return home to Glasgow after the war ended. During these darkest of times, Britain and our allies stood resolute and defiant. And while victory in Europe was achieved on this day 80 years ago, for another 3 months, the war still raged in the Far East. Today, I'm proud to salute the sacrifice, duty and bravery of the greatest generation. They fought and died for our peace and for our freedom, and we all live in their shadow. A famous VE Day cartoon shows a wounded and bandaged soldier emerging from a battle-scarred wasteland. In his hand is a scrap of paper with the words "Victory and Peace in Europe." The caption beneath reads, "Here you are, don't lose it again." Yet here we are again, with war raging in Europe and elsewhere, and the rise of murderous tyrants across the globe. Today we must reaffirm our support for the brave people of Ukraine as they fight for the freedoms that we take for granted. We cannot abandon them. The front line between Russia and Ukraine represents a greater global fault line. On one side, our Western values of democracy and decency, freedom and humanity, and on the other side, bleak tyranny, oppression and an ugly disregard for human life. Today, the West must remember and restate what bonded us between 1939 and 1945. I return to the words of Winston Churchill, spoken on this day 80 years ago. I say that in the long years to come, not only will the people of this island, but of the world, wherever the bird of freedom chirps in human hearts, look back to what we've done, and they will say, do not despair, do not yield to violence and tyranny, march straight forward and die, if need be, unconquered. These words from history ring true today. We cannot become weary or lose our resolve when faced with the murderous regime of Putin and others. And as we remember the fallen of World War II and celebrate VE Day, we must also recommit to supporting our own armed forces. They are not a relic of a bygone age. They are essential to the defence of these islands. Last week, I was privileged to attend the installation ceremony of Major General Bob Bruce as Governor of Edinburgh Castle. Some of the Royal Regiment of Scotland soldiers who took part in this ceremonial event were just days away from deployment, joining our allies on military exercises in Eastern Europe. Recent global events and the volatility of our times means that we must ensure that our armed forces are properly funded and supported. And as we mark VE Day, we should also support the veterans who have served our country. It was my privilege to recently speak with ex-service men and women at the Scottish Veterans' Residence, and I can assure any Member of Parliament that they will get an equally warm welcome if they pay a visit to the centre, which is just across the road from Holyrood. And to conclude, Presiding Officer, let me associate my party with the words of the First Minister. Today is a day to remember all that brings us together and the proud history that we share. VE Day was the very best of Britain and the very best of the British people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Finlay. I now call Anna Sauer, around 5 minutes. Mr Sauer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 80 years ago today, the German Instrument of Surrender was signed by representatives of Nazi Germany, the United Kingdom, France, the United States and the Soviet Union in the ruins of the city of Berlin. With this document, the darkest chapter in the history of Europe finally came to a close. And as the First Minister has pointed out, while fighting would still rage on in the jungles of Burma and the islands of the Pacific, for the first time in almost 6 years, the guns fell silent over the continent of Europe. The Nazi tyranny that had tried to subjugate an entire continent and eradicate an entire people had finally been defeated. And throughout Europe, from the rubble-filled streets of Paris to the bombed-out shipyards of Clydebank, from the devastated villages of Poland and Ukraine to the still smouldering ruins of German cities, an entire continent was finally at peace. Here in the United Kingdom, we celebrated at last the victory that so many had thought would never come, and the victory that sadly so many would never live to see. 6 years of bloody fighting, from the fields of France to the deserts of North Africa, had taken the lives of almost 400,000 British soldiers. 400,000 sons, brothers and fathers that would never return home. 400,000 lives ended early in the fight against that Nazi tyranny. And almost 70,000 British citizens, sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, lost here at home through blitz and bombing, hunger and disease. But the struggle against tyranny was global. Some 15 million Allied personnel from Europe, from North and South America, from Australasia, Asia and Africa gave their lives. And I want to remember all those from across the globe who stood against fascism, including members of my own family who served in the British Indian Army and who fought on the front lines to protect our liberty. I only really get tales about the British Indian Army from my one remaining grandmother, who talks often about her cousins who fought in that war and tragically lost their lives. And actually it makes me think, similar to what the First Minister was reflecting on, is how fortunate we are that we do remembrance service and we have proper records of those that had lost their lives. Actually, in many parts of the world, there are no records that exist, and people only hear the tales because of surviving family members. So I'll never truly know how many family members were lost or how many family members made those contributions. That's the case, I imagine, for communities right across the globe. But thousands of young men from different faiths travelled halfway around the world to answer Britain's call in its hour of need. And these soldiers, we might not know their names, we might not know where they came from, but they too must never be forgotten. And that's why I've been proud to join with campaigners to call for a permanent memorial to the soldiers of the British Indian Army in Glasgow, the city that so many of their descendants now call home. Because the great victory over fascism is their victory too. 6 years of total war that had left our country and the entire continent of Europe on the brink of the abyss. And as the victory was celebrated in the streets of Scotland and the UK, slowly the details began to emerge from liberated concentration camps on the continent. The world learnt the truth about the greatest crime ever perpetrated in human history, the systematic attempt to eradicate the Jewish people. 6 million dead. And many, many more disabled people, LGBT people, trade unionists and minorities killed by the apparatus of the Nazi state. The clock had struck midnight in the story of human history, and yet through the collective will, the united endeavour of people across the world, this evil had finally been defeated. As people across the country celebrated this final victory, the Prime Minister addressed the nation. He said, "God bless you all. This is your victory. In our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. Everyone, man or woman, has done their best." And he was right. The worker in the shipyard, the women of the land army, the soldiers on the front line, the volunteers of the ARP and the Home Guard, the doctors, the nurses, the collective will of the people of the United Kingdom and our allies, united behind the just cause of victory, had proven triumphant. And as this victory was celebrated, the hope for a new and fairer future for our country was born. The comradeship, the self-sacrifice and the unity of war's years had shown to the world the potential that the people of the United Kingdom held. At home, the construction of a new social and political order, one fit for our heroes, began in earnest. Coming out of the war, we developed a proper welfare state, the National Health Service, stronger pensions, new towns, slum clearances, new rights for workers, all delivered in the spirit of victory that people had worked so hard to deliver. And across the world, the need for a new order was clear. The United Nations was established to promote peace across the world, to uphold the ideals that nations can resolve their issues through dialogue and not violence. This was the lasting message of VE Day, the demand for peace, justice and solidarity across the globe. And that's why today, on the 80th anniversary of VE Day, we must all recommit to these ideals, no matter what walk of life people come from, no matter their faith, no matter their nationality, no matter what their vision might be for the broader world. We all have a shared aspiration for peace, dignity and freedom across the globe. So on this day, we remember them, we thank them, but we pledge to carry their values forward. And we think of those too, not just that lost their lives in that war, but those that are losing their lives in wars today. And we resolve to deliver a fairer, more peaceful and more just world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Sarwar. I now call Patrick Harvey, around 4 minutes. Mr Harvey.
Presiding Officer, the motion today reminds us of the hundreds of thousands of UK forces and the tens of thousands of civilians whose lives were lost in World War II. Beyond that, the war caused up to 85 million deaths worldwide, around 3% of the global population at the time. And that number includes the 6 million Jews and millions of others exterminated by the Nazis, and an estimated 40 to 60 million people displaced. But mere statistics aren't enough to truly comprehend the scale of what had to be done to defeat Nazism and fascism, the sacrifice of those who fought, and the scale of the impact on the millions of lives affected. I don't honestly think I can begin to imagine the emotional release that must have come, including in households as described by the First Minister, still suffering their own personal grief while the celebrations began, when that announcement of VA Day came. But in the wake of such suffering, it led to new beginnings. In recognising that they had fought together, had survived together, people decided to rebuild their society together, with a welfare state and a national health service, an astonishing legacy for that generation to leave us. But also the creation of international institutions of peace, a framework of international law, human rights, and what eventually became the European Union. But it's important, too, to remember that VE Day was not the end of the story. Not for those still enduring war in other parts of the world. Not for East Germany, which went from Nazi to communist control. It would be decades yet before they would achieve freedom and join a peaceful and democratic family of European nations. Not for the gay men liberated from the Nazi concentration camps who were re-imprisoned by the Allies. And we must remember too that the struggle to defeat fascism remains our responsibility today, as we see an expansionist war against Ukraine being rewarded on the world stage, as we see the horrific images of genocide from Gaza, as we see the brutality of immigration detention camps and imprisonment without trial in countries claiming to be democracies, as we see far-right ideology growing around the world and the arrest of Nazis in the UK only yesterday, as we hear prominent voices in major political parties seeking to abolish our fundamental human rights and tear up that astonishing endowment the post-war generation left us, and as we see the UK government celebrating VE Day on the same day as they announce an agreement with a US president whose ideology is indistinguishable from fascism. We need to remember that appeasement never works. Presiding Officer, I want to end with the words of Ken Turner, 98 years old, in a video posted on social media yesterday, as he sat in a Sherman tank. Mr Turner served in World War II, as did the tank. I'm old enough to have seen fascism the first time round, and now it's coming back, he said. And then, driving that tank over a Tesla, crushing it, he gave this message to Elon Musk: "We've crushed fascism before, and we'll crush it again." Presiding Officer, Ken gets it. Ken knows what had to be done. Ken knows the cost of what had to be done. But Ken also knows why it had to be done, and he knows that it must still be done. Let's never forget what Ken has reminded us of.
Thank you. I now call on Alex Cole-Hamilton.
And thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's my distinct privilege to offer the respects of the Liberal Democrats to the fallen in our armed forces and those armed forces across the world, to the dead in our civilian population and across the world, and to the victims of the Nazi Holocaust, something we've heard a lot about this afternoon, and rightly so. Presiding Officer, I was reflecting on what this date, this 80th anniversary, means in Germany. And I actually heard a fascinating radio interview with a German diplomat who was asked that question. He explained to the interviewer that in Germany this is seen as a commemoration of liberation, because it was liberation of normal Germans from, in the words of Churchill, the odious apparatus of Nazi rule. And we often forget, I think, at dates like this, of those brave Germans who stood up against Hitler within the Third Reich, who died under its regime for want of freedom. People like Sophie Scholl or Pastor Niemöller, and I am thinking of them today. Today we are also thinking of our brave Scottish communities who, in a singular national effort of determination, pulled together to fight the war effort. Whether that was, I was asked the First Minister about the Polish Airmen. I grew up in a farming village not far from RAF Lukers in Fife. And there's a shed at the bottom of our garden which still had telephone lines and a fireplace from the 3 Polish airmen that lived in that shed for 3 years. Still signs of our collective war effort even still. Just last week, in the communities of Lerwick and Scalawa and Shetland, there was a commemoration of the Shetland bus, which saw merchant navy vessels taking troops and ammunition and weaponry to and from the Norwegian resistance. I pay tribute to all of them. Each of our communities played their part in certain ways, but each of us, like the First Minister very movingly told us, will have personal reflections of this 80th anniversary. And I think of my grandfather and his 3 siblings in particular today. His older brother, Dick, was a German linguist and as such became an interrogator in prisoner of war camps. His younger brother, David, very sadly, a commander on HMS Seek, was killed on a troop transport north of Tobruk, which was sunk by a Stuka dive bomber. My father is named for him, such as the enduring loss of his memory. Their sister, Joan, was awarded an MBE at the age of 23 for her service to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the Norwegian legation, evacuating the king and the government out of Oslo as the Wehrmacht rolled in. She walked overland to a resistance farmhouse led by Frank Foley and was eventually evacuated by submarine. Very sadly, she died in 1945, just after the San Francisco conference that set up the United Nations. Her plane disappeared over the Atlantic, and we still have a letter in my attic from Anthony Eden expressing grave concern for her loss. But it was my grandfather that taught me everything about freedom and about sacrifice. He served as a lieutenant commander on a destroyer in the North Atlantic. He was one of the last surviving witnesses of the sinking of HMS Hood by Bismarck. And he lived to tell the tale. I have 19 hours of audio of his seafaring stories. I treasure them. Presiding Officer, we've heard a lot about the remarks of Winston Churchill from the balcony of the Health Ministry on this day, 80 years ago. And he, I think, it was a very short speech. Much of it has been quoted, but a line that is not is, "My dear friends, this is your hour. This is not victory of party or of any class. It is a victory of the great British nation as a whole. We were the first in this ancient island to draw the sword against tyranny." Presiding Officer, with those words, he closed out a war that had endured 6 years. He ushered in a long peace, and it is a long peace that is incumbent on decision-makers and parliamentarians like us in chambers like this to safeguard for future generations and to recognise those who draw the sword against tyranny in places like Ukraine today. Thank you.
Thank you. We move to the open debate, and I call Karen Adam to be followed by Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 80 years ago, the world exhaled when the guns across Europe fell silent, because VE Day marked not just victory, but our survival, a freedom reclaimed and a future made possible. For me, this day always brings me back to my grandfather, my pa, who fought in the war. And when I was a wee girl, he would tell me stories of his time as a soldier. And although I realise now that the stories were very heavily filtered for my young mind. He was a great storyteller, and to me, war was his great adventure, racing from exploding bridges, laughing with his soldier pals, and falling in love with my gran through letters passed across their worlds. For my young mind, he made it all into a Hollywood movie version. There's one particular story he told that stuck with me as I've grown up in understanding and found deeper meaning in it. And he'd tell me that when the soldiers were lined up for religious observance, Names were called out of particular religions, Catholics, Baptists, Church of England, but my pa would be left standing. So he'd be asked, "Well, what religion are you?" He said he'd straighten his shoulders, chin up and say, "Church of Scotland, sir." And he proudly exclaimed it. Now, that always made us giggle as a family when I was little, but as I've grown up, I can see that there was more to it than just a wee funny story, because in that moment, he was retelling a deep sense of identity, a sense of belonging that mattered so very much to him. He was there, proudly fighting for his country, for his people in Scotland back home. When he was stationed in Italy, my gran was serving here at home as a firewoman, and their love story spanned war zones. I still have the love letters they exchanged, which are filled with words of longing and hope and plenty of darling. They dreamed of being reunited. They dreamed of their future together. And thanks to VE Day, they got that chance. My dad and I are compiling these stories so that we don't lose them to time. But when I do recall them now with my adult mind, I can see the parts that my grandfather had omitted. The fear, the horror, and those soldier pals that didn't make it home. But that's a reality that he chose to shield from me. And that's why, Presiding Officer, we must mark VE Day not just as a celebration, but a solemn reminder. We are here today because our relatives survived, but many never came home. From Scotland alone, 57,000 armed forces personnel lost their lives, and millions more across the world. They sacrificed not just their lives, but their future posterity. So as we honour the efforts of Legion Scotland and Poppy Scotland, who have beautifully marked this 80th anniversary with Scotland's salute to VE Day, I think it's important that we must also acknowledge the deeper meaning behind these tributes. The concerts and the gatherings and the red poppies are not just about looking back with pride, they're about carrying forward a warning. Because remembrance is not passive. It's a deep responsibility on the shoulders of the posterity that is here, that survived. At a time when war again rages in parts of Europe, when hatred is on the rise, when democracy and peace feel very fragile, we must learn from the past. They fought for a world for us to build, not to destroy. We have to remember how we got into war in the first place, and remember what it cost, but also how we come back from it. VE Day should never have to be repeated. So let it remain a celebration of hard-won peace and a call to protect it with everything we have. And for the futures that ended too soon, for those who never got to be, let us mark this 80th anniversary not just with words, but with purpose. Let it be a thank you, but also a promise. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask members who wish to speak in the debate to press their request to speak buttons? And I call Douglas Ross to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And it's a real honour to be able to contribute to today's debate. And I want to associate myself with the motion in the First Minister's name and the very moving speech that he's given today. And as Stephen Kerr said, many of the speeches he has made on this subject in the past. And indeed, it's encouraging that all of our party leaders have taken part in today's debate to show the importance of this issue. And when I was thinking about what to speak about, I wonder, do you focus on the celebration that war in Europe had finished, or do you recognise that war continued for some time thereafter? And I want to do a bit of both, because there is absolutely no doubt it was a celebration. In fact, the royal family put out a comment this morning that then Princess Elizabeth on VE Day went out onto the Mall. She took down her uniform cap so she could go incognito to join the throngs of crowds who had turned out to celebrate. And she then obviously went on to reign over this country for 70 years. But for her, it was important to be part of the people that she would serve for 7 decades. But with many of the quotes that we've had today from Winston Churchill, the one that struck me was the quote when he said, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead." So while there was celebration, there was still much to be done. And I've also been struck throughout this week watching many of the events on television and listening indeed to today's debate that the number of people who fought in that war are ever dwindling. And I'm always watching in the Remembrance Sunday events the smaller numbers of veterans who are marching past the cenotaph. They look older, they look frailer, and they are fewer in number. And it reminds me that we owe them a great debt of thanks for what they did, but we also have an obligation to make sure what they sacrificed during that war, and those who didn't come home, as Karen Adam has just mentioned, their memory lives on in future generations. And this morning my 3-year-old was so excited that he didn't have to wear his normal uniform to nursery, he got to wear party clothes. Now, he doesn't know why he was wearing party clothes, but in years to come he will. And I want to make sure that the next generation know about the sacrifices of the past. And it's in that spirit that I really want to commend to members a 2-part podcast that has been produced by Parklands Care Home. Now, they have care homes across Moray and the Highlands, and what they've done is produced this podcast called Peace at Last, Memories of VE Day, because they don't want these memories to be forgotten. They want them passed on to the next generation. And to listen to some of the experiences from their residents, it will bring a tear to your eye, but tears of sadness about what happened, but also tears of joy about the resilience many of these people still have many decades on, 8 decades since VE Day. And I just want to pick a couple of them who shared their first-hand experiences. Dr Jean Munro is 101 and she's a resident at Linmore Care Home in Granton. And she spoke about being a member of Hut 6 at Bletchley Park. And she really didn't acknowledge how important her role was. In fact, she wouldn't even tell her friends and family until the 1980s about the role she played in the war. And then there's 101-year-old Mamie Cree, and I know Mamie because her son, Stuart Cree, was a Moray councillor and convener of Moray Council. And she speaks about how she was conscripted to go from Keith to Dalkeith in the war. And that was a major thing for her, because she had never travelled further than Elgin. But Mamie speaks about the work she did in army payroll, but she also speaks about some of the more positives, how she went to wartime dances, and it was at one of these dances that she met her future husband Jack, and they were married for 75 years. So I say all this because we must recognise the horrors of war, but we also must recognise these stories will be lost if we do not continue to articulate them in the future. And it's a commitment that I give to my boys and future generations that we must ensure they know about the horrors of the past, and we will never forget the sacrifices of so many in this war and many other conflicts. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Paul O'Kane.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And today we commemorate the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. And on this day, 8 decades ago, the guns fell silent across the European continent, marking the end of a brutal conflict that had engulfed the world in darkness and despair. VE Day stands as a testament to the resilience, the courage and unwavering spirit of those who fought for freedom and justice. And as we reflect on this historic milestone, we honour the sacrifices made by millions of men and women who served on both the front lines and the home front. And I want to reflect on some stories from Aberdeen and the North East. But some stories I don't know. I know that a large group of Aberdeen women were conscripted to work in munitions factories in Coventry. I know this because my grandmother, Violet Morris, was one of them. But I do not know any of her tales from Coventry because she refused to talk about her experiences. Which makes me think that for her and for those young women who had to move far from home, those experiences were pretty grim ones. We also have to look at the fact that war touched every community, with the sacrifice of the Gordon Highlanders touching every part of the globe, from Dunkirk and St Valery to Singapore and Burma, from El Alamein to the beaches of Anzio and Normandy, and onwards they went to liberate Rome and Germany. In the dark days of 1940, the threat of invasion was real, with the beaches of Aberdeen a tempting target. And to this day, our children play among the remains of pillboxes on our northeast beaches. And although the invasion didn't come, those at home were not spared, with Aberdeen enduring 34 bombing raids, with the worst being on the 21st of April 1943, when 31 tonnes of bombs rained down on Hilton and Powys. But despite these darkest of days, through the bravery and sacrifice of our men and women in uniform, victory did come 80 years ago today. And on this 80th anniversary, we are reminded of the importance of solidarity. The victory achieved on VA Day was not the triumph of one nation over another, but the collective victory of all who stood against tyranny and oppression. However, as we honour the past, we must also confront the present, because today we face some of the same challenges as those that forged the peace on VE Day. And I hope that that does not unravel. The far right is again on the rise, not only across Europe and North America, but also here on these islands. The ills of society are once again being blamed on minorities and people from overseas, with older and disabled folk being singled out as a drain on society. These movements, these views, threaten the very values for which so many fought and died for to protect during World War II. So it is our duty today to stand against hatred and division, to uphold the principles of democracy, human rights and the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Paul O'Kane to be followed by Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And today, on this 80th anniversary of VE Day, we pause, and we have paused in this chamber indeed, to reflect on all of those who gave their lives from our communities in the course of the Second World War for the freedom and liberation of Europe and for the peace and security of us all. And, of course, the war memorials in our towns and villages are etched with the names of those who fell on land, at sea and in the air, and made the ultimate sacrifice for the things that we value so much. But today I'm also thinking of those who suffered so much and who lost their lives here in Scotland and in the communities that I represent across West Scotland, thinking, of course, of the terrible toll that the Blitz took on communities in Clydebank and in Greenock and in so many other industrial towns across the West Coast. And to think about the scars that run deep in those communities, even to this day, whether that be scars in the minds of people who survived, physical scars, and of course the scars that were inflicted on the landscape of those communities, never to look the same again. And today, many of us in the chamber have brought personal stories, and we've heard very eloquent personal stories. And I think that's important because many of us have experiences of loved ones who lived through the war and who perhaps served in the war. And I have been thinking a lot about my grandmother today, who would have been 95 if she were still alive. And she didn't live to see me be elected to this chamber and to the Scottish Parliament. But when she passed, she left me a painting of Craigheads in Barrhead, where she was born and where she grew up. And it sits in my office upstairs. And I was thinking about that painting today because that is the house from which my grandmother experienced the Second World War. She would tell us stories frequently about the blackout, about rationing, about carrying your gas mask to school, about the work that she then did when she worked for the local cooperative society in her teenage years in the war. And I was thinking also about how she would have left that close in Craigheads on VE Day to go and join the celebrations in the community of Barrhead. And I remember the sense of relief and the sense of joy that she expressed that war in Europe had finally come to an end. But I think there's something else important that I've been thinking today about my gran and about her generation, and we've heard this articulated already in speeches. But my gran's generation and the generation who lived through the war went on to not only gift us freedom and security, but to gift us so much more in terms of the things that we now value in this country today. They are the generation who rebuilt this country from the ashes and the rubble of war. They are the generation who turned their shoulder to the wheel, having faced the storm, and under a reforming Labour government of Clement Attlee, gifted to us so many institutions like the NHS, the welfare state, new towns and access to education. They did it in their own ways by washing floors or putting bricks and mortar together. They fed children, they helped the ill and disabled. And I think in doing that, they also gave us something more fundamental. They gave us values that endure to this day. The values of standing with and helping your neighbours. The values of hard work and dedication. The values of keeping calm and carrying on. And the values of never, never giving in. So this evening, Presiding Officer, I will join people in my community of Neilston as we light a beacon for peace. And in doing so, I will think of all those who gave their lives, but also who gave so much of the life that they had after the war to building this country. And I will think of my Gran and of all those people who stood with her and that we remember today on VE Day. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Bill Kidd to be followed by Megan Gallagher.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And well, we are gathered here today to mark a solemn and significant anniversary, 80 years since Victory in Europe Day, that moment on the 8th of May 1945, when after 6 long and harrowing years, the guns across Europe finally fell silent. We remember the 380,000 members of the UK Armed Forces, amongst them 57,000 Scots, and we remember the over 67,000 civilians who paid the ultimate price during the Second World War. Each life lost was a son or daughter, a brother or sister, a neighbour, a friend. Ordinary people called upon to do extraordinary things. Today, let us pay tribute not only to those who fell, but also to the living who bore the scars, those who returned home wounded in body or soul, and those whose lives were forever marked by the trauma of what they had endured and witnessed. And let's also honour the brave souls from across the Commonwealth and allied nations whose shared sacrifice helped secure the fragile peace that we have enjoyed in the decades since. We are indebted too to the ongoing work of Legion Scotland and Poppy Scotland, whose efforts, such as the moving national commemorative concert held in Edinburgh on the 6th, ensure that this legacy of service and sacrifice is never forgotten. Scotland's salute to VE Day, supported by the Scottish Government, stands as a fitting tribute not only to those who served, but also to those who continue to bear the consequences of war. But, Presiding Officer, as has been said across the Chamber, it is also our duty today to speak honestly. VE Day was not the end of war. It was not the end of suffering. Just months later, the world would witness the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki when 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on civilian populations, ushering in a new and terrifying chapter of human conflict. Tens of thousands of lives were ended in an instant, and generations continue to suffer from the after effects. Those strikes were not a distant event. They remain a living warning. That terrible power still exists in our world today. The nuclear threat did not die with the Cold War. It lingers in arsenals and doctrines, and it whispers into conflicts that grow more complex and dangerous by the day. It's why we must not only remember the past, we have to learn from it. Indeed, 100 years ago, the Spanish philosopher George Santayana wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And 100 years later, we see that grim warning being made real. War once again rages on Europe's borders in the Ukraine. Civilians suffer, families flee, children grow up to the sounds of missiles, not to music. The echoes of the past resound. The echoes of the worst atrocities of man and humanity are deafening to those suffering in Gaza. Starved and bombed to death, lives extinguished, graves replacing hospitals and schools. A modern-day genocide, some can call it. Presiding Officer, let us be clear, to honour the memory of the fallen is not only to look back, but to stop, look at this and stop war happening again, and to speak out on it. We must ensure that never again is not just a phrase carved on memorial stones, a great phrase and a true one, but never again is a principle that should be carved into the hearts of our politics and our people. We must strive, each and every one of us, to build a world not just free from war, but from the conditions that make war possible. Poverty, oppression, hatred and silence in the face of injustice. So today, Presiding Officer, as we rise correctly to honour the sacrifice of those who fought and died for our freedom, let's not be content with ceremony alone. Let us ensure that we do not sit silently in the face of today's atrocities. Let VE Day's 80th anniversary be not only a moment of remembrance, but be a call to conscience. Let us speak with gratitude for peace, but work with urgency for justice. Let us honour the sacrifice of the past, but act to prevent the suffering of the future, because remembrance without action is remembrance unfulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Megan Gallagher to be followed by Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We must never forget the brave men and women who fell during the conflict of World War II and those who fought to secure our freedoms and liberties that we all take for granted today. We will forever be indebted to our World War II veterans, the sacrifices they made, the friends that they lost, or the stories that they have told. This momentous occasion marks the 80th year since the end of the war in Europe, and in my short contribution today, I wish to focus on why we need to keep marking these occasions. In every community across the country, names are etched into stone, alongside a rank and the date that they died. Those are the names of family members, loved ones who will never be forgotten. We stand at those memorials every year and fall silent. Crowds gathered include veterans of past wars and, of course, more recent conflicts, armed forces personnel, community groups, members of the public and, of course, politicians. We do this because we understand the significance and the importance of past conflicts and how fragile our world actually is. And that's why I'm bringing forward a private member's bill to protect our war memorials, how important it is to make sure that they survive for years to come. Because one day there will be no more veterans left to attend these important occasions. And we must encourage our younger generations to learn what people in our communities fought and died for, the triumph over totalitarianism. Often we are told that there is an over-focus on world wars in our education system. However, given current global conflicts, it has never been more important to reflect on our shared history to ensure that our future is one of peace. The values of Victory in Europe Day are still as relevant as they were then. Presiding Officer, if I may, in my time that I've got left, share an uplifting incentive I read, a fantastic example of how schools can connect with our armed forces and veterans community while learning about the VE commemoration. 1,300 schools, through Together Coalition, requested a letter from a veteran setting out their wartime experience and what it means to them 80 years later. Passing that baton of memory and meaning to the next generation not only helps to close that generational gap, but will also have left a huge impression on young people and the memories they now have of being able to speak to a veteran who lived and fought through the Second World War. The Commonwealth War Graves Foundation are now the proud custodians of those letters. That will have captured those moments in history, but will also form that additional piece that members of the public will be able to reflect on in years to come. I think that's wonderful, and I think that's what we should strive for in our society, connecting older generations with younger generations to learn from past mistakes, but also share those experiences to make sure our future generations do not repeat the past mistakes that have been made in previous. Presiding Officer, I think that there's only one thing left for me to say, and that is we will remember them. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Jackie Dunbar, the final speaker in the open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is an honour to speak in today's debate commemorating the 80th anniversary of VE Day as we remember the sacrifices that made VE Day possible. The First Minister said earlier today that we all naturally think about how the lives of our own families were affected, and I think the stories that came across the chamber today, it's reflected that. For me, my first thoughts are of my granda, Private James Dunbar. He served with the Gordon Highlanders and was captured with the 51st Highland Division at St Valery. When granda left home to serve his country, my dad was just weeks old. After years as a prisoner of war, of which he rarely spoke of, Victory in Europe meant Grandad got home safe. He got home to my granny, their bairns, including my dad, who was by then 5 years old, who had no memory of ever meeting his dad, so this to him was a first meeting. Grandad got to enjoy the peace and freedoms he fought for, and got to see his children and his grandchildren grow up with those. That wasn't the case for thousands of others who served during that war, including 57,000 Scots. Today, as we remember those who lost their lives during World War II and those who contributed to the war effort across that time, I want to urge folk to also reflect on what they fought for. VE Day was a victory for democracy. It ensured freedoms for folk across Europe. The aftermath saw the Declaration of Human Rights agreed and concerted efforts made to maintain and build on what was secured with the end of that long and bloody war. There was a recognition that peace for their time was not enough, and that the work to build a lasting peace is an ongoing process. Scotland has enjoyed 80 years of peace since then, but across the world we are seeing democracy, human rights and basic freedoms increasingly under threat, and we cannot afford to just paper over the cracks. We owe it to those who sacrificed so much to make peace happen in the first place, to ensure it continues for decades more to come. And we also owe it to them and to the veterans since then that have helped maintain that peace, to ensure we look after those who served and their families. Charities such as Poppy Scotland, Legion Scotland, Forces Children Scotland and many, many others go above and beyond to ensure there aren't people slipping through the support net we have in place, and support and stand up for everyone who is part of the Armed Forces family. And I want to put on record my appreciation for the work they do. I want to finish on the point that 80 years on from VE Day, there are not many veterans from World War II left. The youngest, who would have been just teenagers at the end of the war, are nearing 100 years of age. The Second World War is fading from living memory. These next few years will be the last chance we have to hear firsthand about World War II, rather than just reading about it in history books. I hope folk will take that chance to speak to the veterans we have left, not just about what they did, but why they did it. Why it was so important to win that war, and why it was so important that we build peace and commit to not repeating the mistakes of the past. Their legacy is the peace they secured and built on, and that's a legacy we need to ensure is passed on to generations to come. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We move to closing speeches, and I call on Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 80 years ago today, after monumental sacrifice and suffering, Nazi Germany was forced into unconditional surrender. But it wasn't the end of the fighting in Europe. The Battle of Solvici didn't end until the 12th of May. In Odziak in Bosnia, it didn't end until the 25th. Across Europe, people still fought and died for weeks after VE Day in the struggle against the remnants of Nazism. And today we remember them as well. And as the First Minister said, there was 3 more months of suffering in Asia before Japan was defeated. But nonetheless, the greatest moment in the history of Europe was the absolute defeat of the Nazi Empire on the 8th of May 1945. And it is more important now than ever to remember that, as Jackie Dunbar highlights, with that experience fading now from living memory. I will never forget what my gran told me about surviving the Clydebank Blitz, how the children were taken to the bottom of the tenement close, how every adult left to fight the fires, every window shattered, and there was this inescapable orange glow because everything was on fire, that whole community, just 12 buildings left undamaged at the end of that 48 hours. My church was hit. The building took a direct hit from an incendiary and was destroyed. It's so hard to imagine now, though, bombs falling on Clydebank. What an incredible privilege it is to live now in Scotland in this era where that kind of conflict here is unfathomable. The First Minister mentioned the contrast of loss and joy felt by so many families, and Patrick Harvey mentioned how for entire nations that joy was short-lived before the Iron Curtain fell.
I would add to that the experience of the Spanish exile community here in Scotland and across Europe. Nazism was defeated in 1945, but it would take 30 more years before fascism was defeated in Europe, with its end in Spain. And I also want to remember the Scots who volunteered to fight against fascism in Spain before we were forced to do so against Nazi Germany. Nazism was only defeated through unimaginable sacrifice by our armed forces, our allies and resistance movements across the continent. And it was years before we fully understood the scale of the Holocaust in particular. The attempted extermination of Jews, disabled people, LGBT people, the Gypsy Roma traveller community and other so-called undesirables. And when we learned of this, we said never again. The United Nations and the European Union were established on that commitment to peace. But attempted extermination has happened again across the world. It is happening again now in Israel's genocidal assault on Palestine. We have a war of aggression in Europe fought against free and democratic Ukraine by Putin's fascistic Russian regime. Douglas Ross recognised the tension today between reflecting on evil and the suffering that it caused versus the joy at its defeat. And today is a day for both of those. It is a day for us to remember those who were lost, to celebrate the freedom that their sacrifice won, and to recommit to the fight against rising fascism again today, to recommit to the fight for freedom here and now.
Thank you. And I call on Daniel Johnson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I thank members for some very thoughtful and at times moving contributions, because I think that 80 years is an important milestone. 80 years is a lifetime, a literal lifetime since the war ended in Europe. And I think we need to reflect upon that. And very much my personal reflection, and it always is at the moments of silence, is what would it be like? You know, beyond the numbers, which I think we need to remember, and beyond the history and the politics, what would it be like to be one of those young people in a landing craft on D-Day, or in a bomber flying over the darkened skies of Germany, knowing in the latter that you had a 40% chance of survival? Knowing that coming off one of those landing crafts, there was a very high chance that you would be somebody that would lose their life in pursuit of democracy and against fascism. And I don't know what that would be like. I actually really can't imagine it. And I can't imagine it as someone who had come from a civilian life and been conscripted, asked by their country to do that. And I think we need to reflect, as we move past that 80-year anniversary, beyond living memory, we need to keep that fresh, that visceral memory alive, because it must have been incredibly scary. It was an incredible sacrifice, an incredible thing to go through. After all, it was 85 million people lost their lives, 3% of the world's population. It was a conflict, the like of which, the scale of which, we have never seen, and we must never allow to see again. And I think we do need to be concerned. I think members have been right to raise concerns about whether or not we are continuing to learn those lessons. But before I move on, I think we also need to remember that it wasn't just armed forces personnel that made that commitment. The nature of World War II was different. It was a total war. And it was very good to hear contributions from across the chamber. Douglas Murray's reflections about family members going down to Dalkeith to work on army payroll, or Kevin Stewart's family members going to work in Coventry, because there were a vast number of reserved occupations, people whose duty was to serve on the home front, including those conscripted to work in the coal mines. This was a conflict that consumed everyone, the whole of society. Everyone had a part to play, and everyone did. So the scale isn't just the numbers of people fighting, but actually just the fact that it consumed the whole of society, which is why the lessons of World War II are so important. So at this 80-year mark, we need to remember that many of those lessons stem from the fact that World War II occurred just one generation following World War I. That the commitments and the lessons learned from World War II were because we couldn't afford the proximity of another global conflict so swiftly after World War II as had happened after World War I. And I think what is most interesting, and I was very pleased to hear the contributions of both the First Minister and Anna Sarwar, reflecting on the new order that was created, as Anna Sarwar put it, and the institutions that people sought to create. And for me, what I find most interesting, many of those issues, people weren't waiting until after the war. In 1943, Winston Churchill called for the creation of a Council of Europe, which came into being. In 1944 was when the Bretton Woods Convention took place, which sought to create economic institutions, including many which exist today, because the insight was this. The lessons of the First World War was that war was created by economic and political circumstances, and the world had to work together to ensure that those could not. Indeed.
First Minister.
I'm grateful to Mr Johnson for giving way, and I agree entirely with the analysis that he's sharing with Parliament just now. But would you agree with me that there is a particular threat and challenge to the strength of those global institutions at this moment, and there is a duty on everybody to reflect on the significant role those institutions have played, whilst not perfect, to have avoided conflict for many years, and that we need to all recognise the peril that many of those institutions now face?
Daniel Johnson.
I very much agree with that point, and that was the conclusion I was seeking to draw from it. Because while I think people are right to reflect about the rise of the far right and fascism, we must guard against that. I think more fundamentally, we need to understand that those institutions that sought to create economic stability, economic equality, were vitally important ingredients for the 80 years of peace that we've enjoyed. And at a time when people are seeking to retreat into economic isolation, protectionism, there are consequences to that. We actually need a world system where everyone can enjoy, across the world, access to economic prosperity. Because I make this observation, is that absolutely.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm loath to interrupt what I think is a very eloquent disposition as to what happened to the structures of global unity after the war so that we could ensure there was never a war again. But does he recognise that the first treaty of European Union was the coal and steel community, so that no country could ever again build a war machine without a signatory country understanding that?
Daniel Johnson.
That contribution, I think that's absolutely right. That the observation is that our physical security is inextricably linked with our economic security and our political security. The three go hand in hand. We need to protect our physical security, our national security, our economic security and political security, all at the same time. That's what those people sought to do with the creation of structures such as the Council of Europe, the United Nations, Bretton Woods. But it's also what was sought when we undertook, as Paul O'Kane mentioned, that effort of house building and building the welfare state here. Because while that is true at an international level, it is also true at a national level. Everyone must have a stake. Everyone must have a fair share. So as we pass that 80-year mark, and as I bring my remarks to a close, we must, as I think many members have said, continue to remember, as the memory of the war past that of living memory. But let's also remember what needs to be done. Institutions matter. Equality matters, equity matters, and ultimately we need countries across the world to be continuing to work together and not forget those lessons of World War II. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I call on Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's an honour to speak in today's debate marking VE Day, especially as I am the convener of the Armed Forces and Veterans Cross-Party Group, and I'd like to thank Minister Graham Day for his support over the years in recognising the role of not just the group but the veterans community. 80 years ago, Sir Winston Churchill marked this hour of victory with the following words to the British people, and it's much used, but actually it should be. He said, "My dear friends, this is your hour. This is not victory of a party of any class. It's a victory of the great British nation as a whole." He was right. This was a victory that belonged to everyone. The ordinary men and women who had been forced to put their lives on hold, and endure the most awful conflict in human history. They had risen to the occasion like no generation before or since. They fought and died in far-off fields. They suffered night after night of relentless bombing that brought terror to their homes. They raised families and tended the sick while cities fell down around them, and they waded through the rubble to rebuild and carry on. Today, we remember their courage, their sacrifice, and their victory over tyranny. But even as we celebrate that victory, we must never forget that war itself is nothing to celebrate or glorify. Around 384,000 British soldiers died in World War II, including almost 60,000 Scots. 580,000 Commonwealth troops were killed as they fought alongside us. And we must never forget the enormous casualties suffered by our allies either. Sadly, I do not have time to mention every Allied contribution, but I do want to highlight the role of Polish troops played in my own part of Scotland in the early days of the war, with Britain under threat of invasion. It was Polish troops who helped defend the coast between Arbroath and Burnt Island, and we honour them for standing alongside us in that dark hour. But it wasn't just soldiers who suffered. Tens of thousands of British civilians perished too, on the streets, at work, and even in the one place they should have been safe, their own homes. By the end of the war, tens of millions of civilians around the world had been killed, including 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. So, although this is a day of victory, it is also a day of remembrance and reflection. And with that in mind, I'd like to highlight some of the contributions made from members today, focusing on party leaders. The First Minister outlined that few milestones could be more significant in our history. And he spoke about visiting his uncle's grave in Italy and the gravity of loss that his family has felt, and made it clear that decades don't dampen the memory, and what I thought was a poignant and heartfelt contribution. Russell Finlay spoke about 6 years of bloodshed and horror until our country awoke to the light of freedom as the dark forces of fascism were vanquished. And he also outlined a disturbing fact that the average age a Scottish serviceman was killed was only 21, the average age. Anna Sarwar spoke about a global struggle against tyranny, including members of his own family in the British Indian Army, and called for a permanent memorial to these heroes, remarking also that this was a day that this evil was finally defeated. Patrick Harvey spoke about the scale of the impact of the millions affected, and in the wake of such suffering brought new beginnings. Domestically, the NHS and welfare state, and internationally, institutions such as the United Nations. Alex Cole-Hamilton highlighted from a German perspective, for many Germans, today is viewed as a day of liberation against their Nazi oppressors. And he spoke about contributions from all communities, including from his own family. Douglas Ross spoke about the requirement for celebration but also commemoration on this day, and I'll certainly be listening to the podcast to hear the interesting stories. And Megan Gallagher said we are forever in our debt to our veterans, and outlined why it's so important we never forget their sacrifice, and also highlighted the importance of war memorials in supporting us to do so. Presiding Officer, victory in Europe was hard fought, and let's remember, especially in the early days of the war, victory was not certain, But despite that, Britain and our allies stood for what was right. We chose to uphold the rule of law, we chose to oppose tyranny, and we chose to defend freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Graham Day to wind up. Minister.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. I want to begin my contribution by thanking members for their contributions today and to say what an honour it is to close. Every so often there are topics brought forward for debate here in Parliament which by their nature require us to set aside our normal tribalism. This has been one such occasion, and colleagues across the Chamber have very much risen to the challenge with some excellent, memorable and moving contributions, including from Russell Finlay, who helped set the tone for this afternoon by reminding us of the scale of the loss worldwide, 85 million people, and that the average age of a Scottish serviceman killed during World War II was just 21. And let me echo the comments also of Anas Sarwar on the members of the British Indian Army who travelled halfway around the world to, as he said, answer the call, and recognised the tremendous work of colourful heritage here in Scotland in raising awareness and reminding us forever of that contribution. The response to fascism truly crossed nationality and faith, and we should never forget that. Today has served to remind us of how greatly Scotland values and supports our armed forces and veterans, and is a reflection of a proud Scottish tradition. Going back through history, Scotland's always had a close link with its armed forces community, regardless of where those concerned originally hailed from. In large part, that's been due to our regimental structures, which saw traditional recruiting grounds established across the country. I hail from a part of Scotland which was the home of the Gordon Highlanders, in which my grandfather served. The First Minister and I represent the one-time home turf of the Black Watch. But as a nation, we've also welcomed many service personnel and units from further afield. As the First Minister rightly noted in his opening speech, it's important that we remember our links with the Commonwealth and the countless men and women from around the world who fought and suffered alongside the people of the United Kingdom during the Second World War. There were a staggering number of countries actively involved in the liberation of Europe. Over 14,000 Canadians landed in Normandy during D-Day alone, and nearly 1 million served over the course of the war. South Africans, New Zealanders and Australians all fought alongside the British Indian Army during the gruelling Allied advance up the spine of Italy. From even further afield, they were accompanied in their liberation of Italy by an infantry division from Brazil. The Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle played a proud part in liberating their homeland, assisted by French colonial troops from Morocco, Senegal and Algeria, whilst the Polish Airborne Brigade suffered huge casualties at Arnhem. And of course, as Alex Cole-Hamilton reminded us, he reminded us of the Poles who served in the RAF and who then, of course, settled in Scotland. And of course, resistance fighters and guerrillas across Europe played a vital role in keeping hope of eventual victory alive. But it's important that when we reflect, of course.
The wrong button, sorry. Thank you very much. I appreciate the Minister giving way. I wonder if he would take a moment to reflect on the fact that here today it's important that we recognise those like my grandparents who, due to being in a reserved nature, were part of the Home Guard as a dairyman, but also my gran, who fibbed about her age and left the Carlton in Glasgow to come down to Ayrshire in the Land Army, and who only received a medal in recognition of her service in 2008. I think it's important that we remember them.
Minister.
Indeed, I intend to come to that at the end of my contribution. It is, of course, important that when we reflect on the countless sacrifices made during the conflict, that we don't overlook the contributions made by civilians here and elsewhere and the broader impact the war had on them. We should never forget the suffering of families left behind at home, facing the future, uncertain of what would become of their loved ones, and the sad cases of those that didn't come home, that suffering never truly ended for widows, friends and other family members, as the First Minister eloquently reminded us. or those who lost their, if I just make a little bit of progress, or those who lost their lives or homes during bombing attacks, such as the 1,200 people killed during the Clydebank Blitz, which saw only 7 properties left undamaged of the 12,000 or so in the town at the time, leaving over 35,000 people homeless and so many families devastated by loss and injury. It was the worst destruction and civilian loss of life in Scotland in the entire Second World War. The people of Clydebank showed incredible bravery and commitment in rebuilding their community and their lives under such terrible circumstances. In the face of devastation, they pulled together and worked continuously for 3 days to rescue trapped victims and minimise losses. Paul O'Kane was right to remind us of the sacrifice of Clydebank, and I give way to Stephen Kerr.
I can give time back. Stephen Kerr.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way, because he's making a very impressive speech. Would he agree that today's anniversary, and so nearly all of the contributions in this debate, highlight the importance of history and the teaching of history, and that we should as a Parliament be committed to continuing the teaching of the subject of the Second World War in our schools? And would he agree with me that once young people learn the history, as has been the experience in my children and now my grandchildren, they have an awakened appreciation of the value of freedom and the price of freedom and what it takes to stay free?
Minister.
I would agree with that, and I would note the contribution in keeping that tradition, that history alive, of the poppy bud that travels Scotland under the guidance of Poppy Scotland. It certainly brings to life for many, particularly young children, what actually happened there. And I think that's incredibly important. And the resilience that I talked about a moment ago during that time came to the fore once more during, I think, the pandemic, when those who'd been young children back in the early 1940s coped as they did with the social isolation required for society to respond to COVID-19. Much is rightly made of the impact of the pandemic on young people, but often the most elderly in our communities were the most isolated. And that wartime generation really did point the way for us when it came to being resilient in the face of the challenge we faced. And on the subject of showing resilience and coping with adversity, it would be remiss of us all, I think, not to reflect today upon the legacy issues of war carried for years by those who witnessed combat horrors and atrocities during that conflict. Combatants returned in their hundreds of thousands to their civilian lives in the Second World War, many carrying with them some quite awful, unimaginable memories. PTSD was barely acknowledged as a thing back then. Our understanding of its impacts were negligible. It's only now, at a time when PTSD is far better recognised, that we can perhaps reflect on the fact that the impacts of the Second World War on those who served were felt way into the future. And in doing that, I think our admiration for the resilience of that generation is surely only enhanced. My grandfather, Major James Mackintosh, formed the 5th, 7th Gordon Highlanders Old Comrades Association when he returned to civilian life. His commitment to and passion for the task of maintaining the connection with the men that he served with was something to behold. But behind that and the amazing camaraderie of the members lay a deep sadness at the loss, which is reflected, I think, in the fact that the 5th and 7th Battalions of the Gordons were merged due to the losses that each had suffered during the war. There were so few of them left, they could not maintain 2 battalions. And it's a compliment, I think, to the sense of purpose that they returned with, and as I say, that camaraderie, that they placed such importance in maintaining that connection for decades afterwards. Presiding Officer, in drawing my remarks to a conclusion, I want to briefly focus on some of the elements of the Second World War that are all too often overlooked. And I think we all recognise that the role of the Merchant Navy is one which absolutely has often been overlooked when we reflect on the Second World War. Despite the incredible bravery and resilience that the members of the Merchant Navy showed in transporting vital supplies through the Arctic convoys or to mainland Europe and beyond, despite the threat of U-boat attacks. And it would be utterly remiss of us today not to note the many other civilian contributions to the war effort. I'm thinking of the fire service, the Home Guard, as Elena touched upon earlier, and those who work so hard in our shipyards, the munitions factories, and of course the Land Army. They're great examples of that. Presiding Officer, do you have time?
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful for the Minister to take an intervention, and of course in that role of honour of those who didn't serve at the front but ensured that the front could serve, mention should be made, of course, of our mining communities, particularly here in Scotland.
Minister.
Here. My apologies. In listing some, you run the risk of leaving others out, but absolutely correct, Martin Whitfield, to remind us of that. Presiding Officer, 80 years on from the original VE Day, we continue to hold an honoured place in our hearts for those who laid down their lives in protection of ideals and values which we rightfully cherish. All of us owe them a great debt. They will never be forgotten. And as Anas Sarwar said, we must carry forward their values. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on commemorating the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, and under Standing Order 11.2.4, I'm minded to accept a motion without notice that decision time be brought forward to now, and I invite Martin Whitfield to move the motion.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. The question is that decision time be brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? We are agreed, and there's one question to be put, and that is that motion 17457 in the name of John Swinney on commemorating the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed, and that concludes decision time, and I close this meeting.